AQUABIZ, all the best knowledge for aquatic system.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. Very happy to be back here. I was here in September and gave a presentation. Actually, my second presentation has a few elements from that previous one. But before I get into this, I just wanted to add a couple things about the soybeans. That was a really nice overview that you gave. The SSAP, this is that certification protocol for soybeans. This has become important for farmers and producers that are looking for export markets, particularly those that require certified products. And the certification systems that are out there now, ASC, BAP, Global Gap, they require soybeans certified to that SSAP standard. So one of the things about soybeans in Brazil, you know, it's good quality soybeans, but a lot of rainforest has been converted into soybean fields. And so that has impacts on climate change, and those can't achieve SSAP certification. So if you're looking to have your products certified according to international standards and exported to Europe or the North America, you know, you're gonna have to look for those SSAP certified soybean meal products. The other issue that I wanted to mention is that USSEC commissioned some research, I guess about 4 or 5 years ago, to look at the quality of soybeans from different growing areas around the world. And you know, they're basically similar, but there are some aspects of soybeans grown in North America, the United States, that are slightly higher quality issues. Again, the differences were small, but they were definitely there. Okay, so with that as an introduction, you know, I think Chuchai explained a little bit about my background. I've been working in aquaculture more than 40 years, done a lot of different things. This is a topic I talk about in a lot of different contexts. I talk about it with respect to extensive ponds and intensive ponds, and not just that, but the number of farms in a particular area. That also can be discussed in terms of carrying capacity. I don't have time to get into that right now, but I'm gonna focus mostly on more intensive production systems because that is more the context in Asia. I first gave a version of this talk last October in Ecuador. Ecuador produced 1 million tons of shrimp last year, very productive, big ponds, 10-hectare ponds, relatively low density. It's a successful model for them, but they also have carrying capacity issues. So this is an overview of the presentation. You know, I want to talk about carrying capacity kind of in general terms in pond production systems. This probably applies equally well in freshwater and seawater and brackish water context. And then a few minutes to talk about loading limits. And when I say loading limits, what I mean there is the amount of feed that you can put into a pond on a sustainable level, day after day after day after day. And then I want to talk about carrying capacity in some shrimp production systems, again, focusing on the Asian context with smaller ponds and slightly more intensive stocking densities. And then the final part is how to manage that production capacity. Okay, you've reached that limit, that ceiling. How do you use that? How do you manage that to maximize your benefit and your yield? So selecting a stocking density is really a fundamental decision that every producer has to make. And there are a number of things that go into making that decision, and I've listed a few of them here. You need to know what kind of infrastructure you have, what number of ponds, the size of the ponds, whether they're plastic lined or soil. And then each pond is going to have its own carrying capacity, and that depends largely on the water characteristics and the soil characteristics. And again, I'll get into that in a little bit. Then you have variation by season, particularly if there's wide temperature variation. Obviously, the carrying capacity in a warm season is greater than the carrying capacity in a cool season. And probably less so with rainy and dry seasons, although that probably has some influence. And then each pond has its own history. Maybe a pond is old and it's not producing well. A new pond's maybe producing a little bit better, so the history of performance is a factor. And then the experience. You know, a more experienced, skilled farmer is going to be able to produce at a higher carrying capacity than a new farmer who doesn't have a lot of experience. So you can see there's a lot of factors that go into this very basic decision about, you know, what is my stocking density? What should it be? So it's not an easy decision to make. It's pretty complicated. Okay, so here's a slide that kind of graphically depicts what carrying capacity is. And you can see that, you know, this basically is a line that indicates the increase in biomass or increase in feeding rate over time, which is on the x-axis. And what you can see is that there's some limit that is reached, okay, after a certain point. And there's some kind of what I call environmental resistance that imposes that limit. Okay, and I'm going to get into this in more detail, but try to remember this idea of some kind of limit or some kind of resistance that's imposed by the environment on the production system. So I have a couple of definitions here on the right side. Maximum biomass that can be sustained in a production unit. Okay, so that's sort of your upper limit of biomass, okay? The capacity of a production system to assimilate organic matter and metabolic waste. This gets to this loading limits concept that I mentioned, that you can reach to some maximum level of feeding rate, and that is determined by the processes, the natural processes in the pond that are there that can assimilate the wastes that are generated from feeding. And then we have the maximum production possible while maintaining water quality within the tolerance limits of the cultivated animals. So what that suggests is that it depends on what species you're growing, because the different animals have different tolerance limits. I work a lot with tilapia, very hardy with water quality. Shrimp are probably a little more sensitive. So all other things being equal, the carrying capacity for shrimp should be slightly less, okay? So again, you can see it's a little bit complicated. So this is another way to look at carrying capacity, and this is very common sort of ecological model, and it's called a pressure state model. So on the bottom, that's your pressure indicator. And in this case, it would be biomass. So you're increasing biomass along the x-axis here, and then you have a state indicator. That indicates the state or the quality of the environment that changes. And as an indicator, think about dissolved oxygen concentration. So what this says is the biomass increases in your pond, your state indicator, the condition of the environment, is going to go down, okay? Your dissolved oxygen, your average dissolved oxygen, or your minimum dissolved oxygen is going to go down. And what you'll see here is that it's not a linear function. As biomass increases, the state indicator doesn't decrease as a linear function of biomass, but you get to some kind of tipping point. You get to some threshold where you have a rapid change in the environment. So you reach to some kind of biomass, and that's going to be really indicating your carrying capacity. And you see this rapid tipping point, this rapid change in dissolved oxygen or some state indicator of the environment. Again, this is a very generalized schematic representation of carrying capacity that can be applied broadly in ecological models. Okay, so I'm going to make this point repeatedly in this presentation that oxygen is really the critical variable that we should be considering here in this discussion of carrying capacity. There are other variables, and I'll get into those as well, but I want to focus on oxygen. Now, oxygen dynamics are rather complex in most ponds, and that is because you have various processes that are producing oxygen, photosynthesis, we have diffusion of oxygen from the atmosphere into the water and in the other direction, and we have aeration, okay, various amounts of aeration. And then we have processes that are consuming oxygen on the other side. We have respiration by the water, by the bacteria and the algae in the water, by the shrimp crop, and by the sediment if you have a soil-based pond. So at any one moment, those processes change. The rates of those processes vary. So it makes it a little bit difficult to determine the carrying capacity, but the point is that oxygen is the limiting factor. And not just oxygen, but actually getting oxygen down to the pond bottom. So, a lot of the oxygen production in green water shrimp ponds occurs in the upper part of the water column. Sort of the engineering challenge is to get that oxygen down to the bottom where the shrimp crop are. Now Vanemi are a little bit more mobile. They're a little more in the water column compared to, say, Monodon, which are a little bit more benthic. But even so, really the challenge is to have good oxygen conditions down at the bottom. Okay, so one of the important points about carrying capacity is that it's not fixed. You can change it, and you can change it with technology, and you can change it with inputs from outside the pond, and that's what's sort of indicated here. You don't even really need to know the numbers, okay? You just need to know that there's a greater level of intervention, more inputs from outside in terms of feed, in terms of aeration, energy, water exchange, that kind of thing. And then your carrying capacity increases. And it doesn't increase in a linear fashion. It increases more or less in a stepwise fashion. As you change the package, the technology package that you're applying to the pond, you can increase the carrying capacity in these stepwise functions so that it goes up. And you can see the kinds of inputs that you're applying the pond to change that carrying capacity, okay? So here are some numbers. And I don't really have numbers for shrimp, but I would say that these numbers for tilapia probably apply fairly well to shrimp farming context. And over here, you have the various combinations of inputs, stocking, feeding, aeration, water exchange, that you're applying to achieve these different yields. The important part of this table is on the right-hand side, and that's the limiting factor. That's the thing that's imposing this environmental resistance to carrying capacity that I showed in that first or second slide. And you can see under very extensive conditions, it's basically the availability of natural foods under very low stocking densities like you'd see in these kind of shrimp mangrove systems where you're stocking less than 5 animals per square meter. But you can see that at production intensities ranging from about 3 tons up to 10 tons per hectare, that dissolved oxygen is the main limiting factor, okay? So once you get beyond 10 tons, then really it's the accumulation of metabolites in the pond. And that could be ammonia, it could be nitrite. And really from my perspective, it's related to the accumulation of solids. Okay, so if you have to start getting solids out of the system once you get up to above 10 tons per hectare, in my estimation. But you can see that as long as you keep adding aeration and taking care of the metabolites, you can keep increasing the carrying capacity, okay? So very intensive systems are possible. All right, I mentioned this earlier. This is sort of the second part in talking about loading limits. So this is related to how much feed you can add to a pond, again, on a more or less sustainable level. And it changes quite a bit. So ponds have some inherent capacity to treat the waste from feeding. Okay, they have these natural decomposition, nutrient uptake, nutrient transformation processes that normally occur. There's really no cost for those as long as you're operating within those limits. And generally speaking, though, we have a fairly low degree of control over really the most important water quality variable of all, and that is temperature. Okay, so loading limits are, again, not a fixed thing. Now, these are kind of the factors, I think, that are most important. And again, temperature is number one. It affects the kinetics of reactions. It affects the metabolism of bacteria and the shrimp and the algae. So, all of that is really governed by temperature as a master variable. Oxygen is key. Again, I'm emphasizing this point. And really, there are 2 aspects of oxygen. One is the amount that you're adding in kilograms per day or kilograms per hour, some kind of rate of oxygen addition that matches the requirements of the system that you're operating. The other aspect of it is to maintain a minimum concentration, okay? And I'll get into that a little bit later. And I mentioned this before, water quality tolerance limits, that's going to affect your loading limits. More sensitive species, lower loading limits, less sensitive species, higher loading limits. And then you have these various processes, these natural processes in the pond for decomposition of organic matter. Some ponds now are engineered, these intensive ponds are engineered with central drains where you can remove solids, and that has a profound effect on loading limits because you get rid of those solids from the system. And then again, you've got these natural processes to remove nutrients, algal uptake, nitrification, fixation by the bottom sediments. All of those are important to determine carrying capacity. So it's complex, and you really have this interaction going on between the biology of the animal, these are these tolerance limits, water quality tolerance limits, the climate of the area, so site selection is what's responsible here, and the ecological characteristics of the pond, which have a lot to do with how you manage it as farmers. So here's some numbers, and you know, I need to revise this table. Let me just tell you that right now. Based on, I've given this talk now, this is the third time on my visit in Southeast Asia, and talking with producers, I see opportunities to change this table, but I want to emphasize one thing here, that this number, 200 to 300 kilograms per hectare per day, I think is the limits for green water systems. So if you're just operating a pond and you're relying mostly on algae to take care of your water quality, that's the feeding limits that you can sustainably apply to a pond. If you're going to remove solids with these central drains, okay, which are now common in intensive shrimp production systems, you can achieve much higher loading limits. And my estimation is something on the order of 1,000 to 1,200 kilograms per hectare per day. Again, it depends on how much solids you're able to remove, but quite a bit higher loading limits are possible if you remove solids. Okay, now one of the things about those numbers that I just showed you, if you took any line in that table that you reach some kind of design carrying capacity, some kind of design loading limits. Now, you as a producer can make a decision, well, I want to go higher than that. Now, if you go higher than your loading limits, you enter a zone where you have increasing instability in the water quality. And likely what that means is more episodes of low dissolved oxygen. Okay, you're sort of losing control of the system. You're happy to go there and to add more feed than the loading limit. But once you get up here, and if you get up 50% more than your loading limits, you get into some extremely critical territory. So you have to ask yourself how much tolerance of risk do you have, okay? Because that's essentially what you're talking about here is high risk tolerance. This is basically a safe operating zone when you're within your carrying capacity, okay? Now, I mentioned again, oxygen being important. It's important as a stress factor, and particularly low dissolved oxygen. And I've listed actually a whole number of stress factors over there in that box on the right. So you can take any one of these and put it into this box, and it's probably going to have very similar effects. And let me just go through this rather quickly here. But basically, what I'm saying is stress has three main kinds of effects that ultimately affect profitability of an operation. And it affects it in very fundamental ways to aquaculture production, which is basically number of animals times survival times growth rate, okay? So here, this line affects survival. So if you have stressed animals, it's going to affect their ability to fight against disease. So if you have more disease, you have lower survival. That's going to affect yield, which will affect profitability. So stress also affects the abilities of the animal desire to eat, okay, to consume feed. And what that does, it will reduce growth rate. And by reducing growth rate, that's going to reduce yield, which will reduce profitability. The other thing is that of the feed that it does eat, okay, the amount that is actually digested well goes down, okay? And this is in the literature. This is very clear. And that's going to affect feed conversion ratio. You're just going to have a higher feed conversion ratio, and that affects profitability directly. So a stress factor, like all these stress factors, can affect survival, growth rate, and feed conversion, all of which affect system profitability. So managing oxygen is really key. Now this is an important graphic here. This is the results of a study done in the laboratory, but I think it bears, it should apply in the field. There's no reason why it wouldn't apply in the field. And basically what this is saying is that you have dissolved oxygen concentration here, and this is basically a maximum respiration rate. So the way to look at that maximum respiration rate is that's the maximum growth potential of that animal. And with shrimp, what they do is if the DO is above 5 or 6 milligrams per liter, you have maximum growth potential. But if it gets below 5 or 6 milligrams per liter, the shrimp will adjust its respiration rate. It will reduce its respiration rate when the dissolved oxygen concentration gets low. And when it reduces its respiration rate, it's reducing its growth potential, okay? So it's important to really always maintain dissolved oxygen conditions at the highest level possible because that's going to maximize your growth potential. Now, there are other things that are going to affect growth, but you want to maximize the potential. So here in the middle, this is a typical oxygen profile from a green water pond. You have a lot of fluctuation going on in the oxygen. It goes up during the day and it goes down at night. And if you get down into this orange and red zone, you're operating down here. So you're losing growth potential when the system goes there, okay? So you always want to maintain up here in this green zone. And I think, you know, farmers in Asia, I think, have a recognition of this now. I think this is good. This is a good thing. We don't see this so much in Latin America with the shrimp farmers I work with. So having kind of that above, staying in that green zone all the time will give you the best results and obviously less stress on the animal as well. Okay, so now I want to get into this third factor, and that is some carrying capacity of some different shrimp production systems. I really like this graphic. This comes from Robbins McIntosh, who many of you probably know. He works here in CP as a vice president, and he developed this graphic some years ago. So he talks about shrimp production systems in terms of generations. So there was an earlier generation and a later generation. That's what the numbers mean, the G1, 2, 3, 4. But I just want to call your attention to a couple things in this graphic. Really, these numbers here that are indicated, those are carrying capacity numbers, okay? And this goes back to an earlier point I made, that if you change the technology package, you can increase the carrying capacity of the system. So I think these numbers are useful guidelines. I agree with these numbers. In my experience working with producers in Asia and Latin America, you know, mostly in Latin America, this is where we're operating. You know, the misleading part of this graphic is that there's been an evolution, but in fact, the fact of the matter is that all of these systems are there in the world simultaneously, okay? I've drawn a red box around these two because if you look down here at these numbers, so this is basically the percentage of shrimp grown globally under these types of systems. So most of the shrimp, and this was 17, these are old numbers, so it's probably even higher right now. So most of the shrimp in the world are grown in these so-called Generation 3 systems that are using domesticated vanami and are producing about 10 to 20 tons per hectare in 0.5 to 1 hectare ponds, okay? Another important point here about carrying capacity is that as the size of the production unit goes down, you as a farmer or culturist have more control over water quality. And as such, you can achieve greater yields. So you can see that pretty plainly here. These are the size of the production units. And I'm sorry I don't have it in rye, but you know, I think many of you can make this conversion. And you can see the kinds of carrying capacities that you can achieve with systems like this. And you can see the general trend as well. Okay, let me give you a couple concrete examples. This is a biofloc system. Now, biofloc, I worked a lot with biofloc, and it was popular 10 or 15 years ago. I think there's been some changes, but you know, this is just an example. And you can see there are small ponds stocked up to 150, a lot of aeration. You know, you need that aeration to keep those solids in suspension, sludge removal, and you keep solids at about 15 milliliters per liter in the Imhoff cone. I don't know if you're familiar with these cones. You let the solids settle, and you control nitrogen by adding organic carbon sources. That's essentially how that works. And this is basically what you can get, 20 to 25 tons. And you know, again, I agree with these numbers. This is commercial experience that you're able to obtain. Now, some of the farmers in Indonesia, they made some adjustments. They call it a semi-biofloc system. And one of the things they did is they reduced the amount of solids. And what that does is it reduces your risk and it reduces your requirement for aeration. And so you really have kind of a mixotrophic or a hybrid system between algae and bacteria. It's still predominantly bacteria because your loading limits are quite high. You're above that green water limit. They're stocking a little bit less than the previous example, and you're getting a little less out of it, 15 to 20 tons. So it's a little less risky and a little less productive, but it's something that they're a little bit more comfortable with. Okay, so in Asia, there's sort of a general rule that people apply, and that is that 1 horsepower of aeration can support about half a ton of shrimp. Okay, it's a general rule. It's not fixed in the literature. There's actually very little scientific basis for this rule. It's just a general rule that producers have learned from experience. And so based on this rule, and this is another way to say that rule, horsepower per hectare is about the same as a feeding rate of 10 to 15 kilograms per hectare per day. And so these are some of the stocking densities and the aeration rates and the yields that can be obtained. It doesn't apply exactly to this rule because when you get down to lower stocking densities, the rule bends a little bit. You can actually support less shrimp with a horsepower of aeration. But when you get up to high stocking densities, it's definitely a good rule to follow. So these are some of the yields that can be obtained. Again, this is your carrying capacity. You have more aeration in the system, you can achieve greater yields. Pretty simple there. All right, this graphic, I just want to point your attention to this. This was the results of a survey that was done by Dr. Boyd and some of his colleagues in some work done for the World Wildlife Fund. And what they found, you can see some of the countries here, some of the stocking densities. Here's Thailand. These are the aeration rates that are found, and these are kind of averages. You know, they're going to be higher or lower depending on what farm you visit. This is the number of hours operated, and that's kind of what I wanted to show you here, is that it's not just the amount of aeration, but the number of hours, and then the average yields that can be obtained. That's sort of national yields, and you can see a lot of variation, but generally more intensive. The other thing I would point out to you here is that here's Ecuador, and actually this is probably even higher a little bit now, but it's in this range, and this is the yield that's obtained in large ponds. All of these others, from India on down to Indonesia, are small ponds, 1 hectare or less, usually half hectare or less, okay? And Vietnam in particular has gotten very intensive. All right, I'm going to have this graphic in my next slide as well, and I'm going to make the same point, is that this shows you the oxygen requirement that you have to supply for every kilogram of feed that you're putting into the pond. And it's roughly 1 or 1.2. It depends on the feed conversion. If you have a bad feed conversion, your feed oxygen demand is going to be higher. But it's roughly 1 to 1. And we can break that apart from these different components. One component is the respiration by the shrimp. And that's approximately 25% of the total. About a quarter of the feed oxygen demand is actually the respiration by the animals. About half of it is the oxygen demand by the bacteria that are decomposing the waste organic matter, okay? So if you're removing solids from a central drain, you're sparing the oxygen that you're providing in aeration, and then it can go to the shrimp instead. You're not using it for the decomposition because you've gotten the organic matter out of the system. So this is an argument. This feed oxygen demand is a big argument for trying to get solids out of the system, thereby allowing much higher feeding rates than I showed you for just green water systems. Vietnam is a very interesting example with respect to carrying capacity because there's, what is there, 2, 4, 6 different ways of growing shrimp in Vietnam. All of them are happening simultaneously right now. And I've highlighted the ones that are more intensive, and we're getting into these super intensive systems now, and you know, I just came from Vietnam to here, and you know, they're reporting even higher numbers than I'm indicating here, but that's probably a good range to consider. And again, this is carrying capacity, 20 to 40 tons per hectare. So here's another example of a system. This actually comes from Thailand. I know a lot of farmers not really applying this system, but I like kind of the general concept here. And basically you have a shrimp pond here with a central drain, and the solids are collected, and then they're sent, here's the central drain, they're sent over to a treatment pond. The first part of the treatment pond has a very deep pit. So this is where the solids that are going to come out of the central drain are going to accumulate here. And you'll have a lot of fermentation. And then they go through this sort of green water serpentine and are then returned to the grow-out pond. And these grow-out ponds are 0.4 hectares, so what is that? That's a quarter rye, right? And you can get, again, very high feeding rates, so that's over 1,000 kilograms per hectare per day, and you can get yields of 25 tons per hectare. Okay, so you can see kind of in a consistent pattern of yields associated with these intensive shrimp production systems, 20, 25 tons per hectare being kind of an average. Okay, let's talk about how to manage carrying capacity, and this is the last part of this presentation. One of the big changes that's happening, and this is actually one way I think you can increase carrying capacity a little bit, and that is by increasing feeding frequency. Now, a lot of the farmers that I worked with in Latin America, they put feed in a canoe, a boat, and they go out in the pond and they shovel it into the pond once or twice a day. That's been the traditional way. There's been kind of a revolution now. We're using a lot more automatic feeders where you're feeding shrimp every 10 minutes. And by doing that, you're spreading the load out during the day. And when you spread the load out, you can actually put more feed in the pond. Okay, so that's a way to increase carrying capacity, is by increasing feeding frequency. So I've talked about technology packages, and this is kind of what's going on in Ecuador now. And I keep bringing up Ecuador because I work a lot with the farmers there. And all of these things have been happening. All of these are changes that have happened in the industry that have contributed to its amazing success. Starting with feeds, you know, the quality of feeds is much better now than it was even 10 years ago. There's a lot more extruded feeds. And the reason they're using a lot more extruded feeds is that they're using in automatic feeders. And those have been absolute game changers in the system. Increasing the feeding frequency is really key to getting good, efficient growth. They're using a lot of multi-phase grow-out systems. This is a way to increase carrying capacity as well. More aeration, they're using bioremediation, and they're using good genetics. Okay, so all of these taken together are ways to increase carrying capacity. And I want to focus here on some genetics, and I'm not here to sell CP genetics, but I will tell you that, you know, if use the best genetics that you can put your hands on, okay? And if you're not using the best genetics and your neighbor is, you're falling behind your competitor. So use good genetics. And why? Here's 3 different strains of shrimp. Look at the days of culture. If you want to manage your carrying capacity, you want to turn over your crops as fast as possible. That's a way to manage your carrying capacity to get good production per year from the system. Okay, that's managing carrying capacity. Another way is to use nursery systems. Now, if you do direct stocking from a hatchery and you grow up to a harvest size, and assuming that this is your carrying capacity level, for the whole first part of the culture, you have this huge amount of unused carrying capacity. So you want to try to stock a larger animal in the system so that you're better utilizing the carrying capacity. So I don't have time to go into all the aspects of this graphic, but using nursery systems, okay, 1-phase, 2-phase, even 3-phase nursery systems will give you better survival, better feed conversion, better growth rate, and a lot of it is really based on rotation, just turning over your crops, more crops per year, better utilization of the carrying capacity that you have, okay? So there are a lot of examples of different kinds of nursery systems out there, and it really kind of depends on your goal in terms of the size that you're going to grow them to before stocking. So if you're going to grow animals up to 1 to 3 grams before you transfer, small ponds, and this is the carrying capacity that you can obtain. All right, I think I'll just go past this one. I wanted to talk about a large farm in Vietnam, and they have developed a couple different production systems that they use. They grow a lot of shrimp in very extensive systems that they sell to an organic certified market in Europe, but they also grow a lot of shrimp in these super intensive round tank systems, and they call it a 2-3-4 system. And so 2 aspects I want to focus on here. One is the nursery grow out. So they basically have 2 phases, all right? So they're growing shrimp for about a month, okay, in this size tank, 200 square meter tanks, and then they shift them over to grow out for the second phase. Now the other thing they do to maximize the carrying capacity is they do partial harvests. So you basically grow shrimp up to your carrying capacity, you harvest a certain amount, you grow them up to carrying capacity again, you harvest a certain amount, you grow it up to carrying capacity again, and then you harvest the whole crop. Okay, so that's what they do with the 3 harvests. So there's 25%, 25%, and then 50% of the crop is obtained. But that's how you utilize the carrying capacity, okay? You grow it up to that level. And I'll give you a specific example, okay? Let's assume carrying capacity is 25 tons per hectare. Grow it up to 25 tons, harvest 10. Grow it up to 25, harvest 10. Grow it up to 25, harvest 25. How many have you produced? 45 tons per hectare. Your carrying capacity is 25, okay? So that's a way to manage it. All right, so there are a lot of these round ponds here, and this is really changing a lot in Vietnam. There's, I originally thought these were subsidized by the government. Apparently they're not. The shrimp farmers have basically taken on themselves. You can see this is an old pond, and they've taken this old pond, and now they've got 6 round tanks in here. Again, you'll see typically 2 sizes of tanks. One is like in the 100 to 200 square meter range, and then the others are 800 to 1,000. And these are the carrying capacities that you can get. Now, I wanted to point out something here with respect to size, and this gets to the water quality tolerance limits issue. These smaller shrimp have lower water quality tolerances, so you can't quite grow to the carrying capacities that you can with the larger shrimp that are a little more tolerant, okay? So those are some numbers there. Yeah, and this pretty much shows the same story. Again, you've got biomass that changes, and it really depends on the size of the shrimp that you're growing. Yeah, so this is the Minfu system. These are basically water treatment ponds ahead. These are the nursery tanks, and then these are the grow out tanks, the second phase that they use. Okay, just to wrap this up now, so I emphasize this point about the need for good oxygen supply, maintaining not just sufficient quantity, but the sufficient concentration, best growth at 5 to 6 milligrams per liter. Green water systems, 200 to 300 kilograms per hectare is a reasonable loading limit. If you're taking out solids, it's probably 5 times as much. It could be 1,000, 1,200 kilograms per hectare per day in these small ponds. So it really depends on the size of the pond and definitely how much aeration. I gave you that rule of thumb of a ½ ton per horsepower, and how much solids you're getting out of the system. Because when you get that super intensive systems, you're shifting from oxygen as a limiting factor to solids as a limiting factor. Yeah, and as I said, in these super intensive ponds, it's really the accumulation of organic matter and the consequences of that that are going to affect carrying capacity. Yeah, so keep the bottoms clean, and you can increase the carrying capacity by increasing feeding frequency, automatic feeders, genetically improved shrimp, and multi-phase grow-out systems. And it really is one of the keys to profitability in shrimp farming. There's no doubt about that. Okay, with that, I'll thank you for your attention. I have another presentation coming up in a little while. Thank you for coming today.